I did want to react to some of the polling data, and on the first, I think it was the first polling point that you mentioned about gauging individuals' assessments of sort of threat perceptions. Is the world becoming more dangerous, less dangerous? And my own views are on this particular question are somewhat in flux. I think if you had posed this question to me 5 years ago, 10 years, certainly 10 years ago, I think that I would have been much more inclined to say, and I think still on balance, if you were to say, is it or is it not? I think still on balance, I might be sort of slightly inclined to say that we inhabit safer times. Then if you look at certain metrics, sort of number of interstate wars, number of fatalities in interstate wars. But my views are now more in flux, in large part due to some scholarship that's been emerging. I think that there's sort of a counter narrative. There was a narrative that had begun emerging, I would say, kind of maybe sort of early 2010s. It started gaining some traction, I think, in the early to mid 2010s, saying that, look, the world is dramatically safer. But now we're starting to see some pushback. And I think I've been particularly influenced by some work that Tanisha Fuzzle and her colleague Paul Post have done. They wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs, I think it was published last year, and I believe that Foreign Affairs selected it as one of the editor's picks for top 10 essays that came in their print edition last year. And they make the point that we shouldn't be lulled into complacence by that narrative. And they adduce a wealth of evidence to demonstrate that perhaps, so one point that they make, which I find compelling, is that our views of sort of prevalence of war, lethality of war, have been too heavily weighted or too heavily skewed by World War I and World War II. Now, of course, if you look at World War I and World War II, if those are your benchmarks, then it seems unlikely, and let's pray that it remains unlikely, that we will ever again approach a level of conflict in which we're talking about casualties in the tens of millions. But they make the point that if you look at World War I and World War II as not as sort of the norm for great power war, but as aberrations and really catastrophic aberrations, that then the picture actually becomes a little bit more cause for concern, and that there actually have been, according to the definitions that they employ, there actually have been armed confrontations between great powers. They haven't necessarily risen to the level of lethality for World War I or World War II, but that doesn't mean that World War I and World War II are the only examples of a great power war in recent memory. And so I found that point very, very compelling. They also talk about the role of technology. And I think that if you look at the intersection of intensifying great power tensions, on the one hand, increasingly sophisticated technologies that in many cases are progressing far more rapidly than sort of human comprehension of those technologies, that nexus is quite dangerous. And there's a lot of excellent scholarship that's been done on this topic. So just to list some pieces that come to mind. So I mentioned the piece by Tanisha Fuzzle and Paul Post. Rebecca Hersman has a very disturbing, but I think thoroughly illuminating piece in a recent issue of the Texas National Security Review on this phenomena that she calls wormhole escalation. And she talks at a very granular level about the intersection of emerging technologies and great power tensions. And she makes a number of points on this point about whether the world is getting more or less dangerous. She said, number one, some of the traditional firewalls between the realm of the conventional and the realm of the nuclear, some of those firewalls are beginning to erode on account of emerging technologies, and that has implications for deterrence. It has implications for signaling. What about the possibility of unintended escalation? So Rebecca Hersman's piece is very compelling. James Johnson wrote an essay recently in a recent issue of the Washington Quarterly in which he talks about the destabilizing effect that the developments in artificial intelligence could have on nuclear escalation. And particularly when we're talking about, and this is something I worry about in terms of a potentially more dangerous world, the intersection of, we talk a lot, and I know that our conversation is focused on great power tensions, but we are entering a world of emerging, you could say, nuclear multipolarity. And so talking about, when you think about how difficult arms control was in just a bipolar context, so in a US-Soviet context, think about how difficult arms control was then between two powers when we didn't have all of these emerging technologies to contend with. And now think about the United States, China, Russia sort of at the great power level, then nuclear multipolarity with other powers that are maybe not sort of they're maybe not as great in terms of overall sort of power projection capacity as the United States, China, and Russia, but nonetheless are developing arsenals. So, and then emerging technology. So it's a long-winded way of saying that perhaps this is the congenital optimist to me. I think if you put a gun to my head and said or asked, do we live in a safer world or a more dangerous world? I still am inclined to say that on balance we live in a safer world. But I think if you look at emerging technologies, if you look at the emergence of nuclear multipolarity, and frankly, if you just look at some of the incidents that have been taking place in recent months, I think that China's incursion over the line of armed control with India and the skirmishes there that left 20 Indian soldiers dead, I think that incident bodes very ominously for the situation between China and India. If you look at the increased militarization of the South China Sea, the potential for some kind of escalation there, so there's a lot to be worried about there.